Hello, my name is Tanya Vela, and I am the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Southeast region. I'm also a Certified Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator and an occupational therapist. Today's presentation is on best practices for accessible communication. Presenting alongside me today is my colleague, Julie. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Thanks, Tanya. My name is Julie Lasher, and I'm the Business Relations Specialist in the Southeast region. We planned for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the resource guide and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text known as alt text to visual images. Also in our delivery today, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. For the webinar, we edit the transcript, fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive to everyone. Tanya, will you share an overview of today's webinar?
Sure. Most organizations and businesses communicate in a variety of ways. We prepare materials, announcements, and social media posts for our colleagues, other businesses, customers, and guests. In this training, we will discuss why creating accessible communication is important and include information about accessibility requirements. We will cover various ways we communicate and include accessibility guidelines and best practices to make materials accessible for a wide audience. And finally, we'll share information on how to make communications accessible with tools and resources to help your organization prioritize accessibility and create communications everyone can use.
Thanks, Tanya. We'd love to hear from our audience about ways that you communicate at work. So let's take a quick poll. And you'll see the question should pop up. What is your preferred mode of communication at work? Is it email, chat, phone, or in person?
Well, it looks like a lot of people like to communicate via email.
Yeah. So then we're pretty equally divided after that with chat might have a little bit of an advantage over in person. It doesn't look like too many people like the phone as much as the other options now. So, okay, it looks like responses have slowed down. So thank you, audience. About half of you prefer email to chat and in-person communications. So my favorite way is probably to communicate through chatting it through Teams. Tanya, what's the main way that you communicate at work?
I guess I'm like our audience. I prefer to communicate by email while at work, but there are many ways to communicate. A few examples include printed materials like instructions in a manual, audio recordings of trainings, visual information like flyers or posters in the break room. In addition to these, we depend on the digital environment for just about everything we do. So, what do we mean when we refer to accessible communications? Accessible communications means we're creating and delivering information which is easily understood, can be made available in preferred formats, and is usable by all individuals, including people with disabilities. We can create accessible communications by recognizing barriers and taking into consideration how people with disabilities can effectively access the information. Creating accessible materials from the start begins with asking ourselves questions, such as, how would a person who is deaf or hard of hearing know what is being said in a video? What about a person who is blind who is accessing written material on a website? Is the information included in a newsletter or instruction manual written using clear and plain language that's easily understood? Or are online materials available in alternative formats, such as a job application and an accessible PDF. Julie, before we continue, let's review an example of a document that is not accessible.
Great idea. So we have an image of a newsletter on the screen for you to review. The newsletter is titled AO Times and provides some updates on Accessible Ohio, also known as AO. There's a section of light blue boxes with white text giving information about how to connect with OOD and a hyperlink to an email address. There are two pictures. One is a father and a daughter, and the other is a picture of our Accessible Ohio team. Also included is OOD's mission and an overview of AO services. At the bottom of the newsletter are emojis of people using mobility aids and 6 smiling face emojis. So audience, please take a moment to review the newsletter and take note of anything that might present a barrier to someone with a disability. We'll be discussing these later. So until then, let's take another poll. We'd like to hear from you. What do you consider when making sure that your communications are accessible, using easy to read fonts, alternative text for images, plain language that's clear and concise, or all of the above? A great amount of responses, and it looks like pretty much the poll is saying that about 92% of you are selecting all of the above, which is the correct answer. So we'll be discussing these as well as some of the other methods to consider when you're focusing on accessible communications. Thanks for participating. Hey, Tanya, let's talk about some of the guidelines and best practices which could positively improve this newsletter and be applied to all communications.
Sounds good. Accessible communications are supported by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. The ADA is a civil rights law that makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all facets of public life. Title I prohibits discrimination based on disability in all aspects of employment and requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities when needed. Now, Title II prohibits discrimination based on disabilities in programs, services, and activities offered to the public by state and local governments. And then Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability in commercial facilities and places of public accommodation. So when we consider how people with disabilities will access information and materials, we can then follow guidelines and implement accessible practices to foster inclusive communications. The ADA requirements are meant to ensure individuals with disabilities can access communications just as effectively as individuals without disabilities. Most of our communication happens in the digital space, specifically on the internet. Julie, let's start with digital accessibility.
That sounds great. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, is the international standard for web accessibility. This includes websites, web content, applications, or apps. WCAG defines how to ensure that these are more accessible and usable by everyone, including people with disabilities. These guidelines can be used to assist in planning, creating, and maintaining websites. We're going to talk about some of the accessibility principles to consider in communications, and then we'll discuss how accessibility impacts the various modes of communications commonly used. While much of what we'll discuss today applies to digital communications, it can also be helpful for communications that happen in person. The accessible principles that we'll discuss and address today are font, language and format, color, alternative text known as alt text, audio, hyperlinks, emojis, hashtags, and GIFs. Tanya, let's discuss these principles one at a time and start with fonts.
Some fonts are easier to read than others. To ensure the font being used is accessible, it's important to consider the font size, style, spacing, and weight. We also have a few general practices to share related to font and text. One thing to keep in mind is font size should vary based on the type of communication. For standard printed materials, use a minimum 12-point font size. For large print, a minimum 16-point font size is needed. According to the American Printing House for the Blind, 18 points or larger is best for large print documents. For websites, 12-point is generally suggested for regular body text, and 18-point for larger is recommended for large text. And finally, PowerPoint slides should use font size of 24, according to the Association of Research Libraries. Remember, these are suggested sizes and can always be customized when needed. Julie, what about font style?
It's best to choose a font style that's simple and easily understood and not complex, stylized, or fancy. On the slide is an example of WebAIM's resource. Audience, but feel free to enter into the chat which examples are easier to read, and the statement on the top written in italics or the statement on the bottom. Definitely seeing lots of the Great. Okay. So as most of you noted here, the second sentence is easier to read. So let's talk about why. The first font is a tight cursive with curly tips and several letters, and it's also italicized. So the second font does not include any curly tips, and each letter is distinct, and it's not italicized. So the second font is much easier to read and understand. An additional best practice is to limit the quantity of font styles used. While it's not likely a writer would use multiple fonts in short communications piece, a writer might use varying formats in longer communications, such as sections in a newsletter. Limiting those types of fonts or sticking with just one style can assist with accessibility in your document. Tanya, can you tell us a bit about font spacing and weight?
Sure. Font or letter spacing may impact readability. On the slide is an example from WebAIM. Is the word cod or is it cool? Audience, what do you think? Let me know in the chat. We've got cool, we've got cod. Cool, cool, cool. Ooh, someone says it's neither. It looks like the majority are saying cool, but we've got people weighing in that think it could be either or neither. Oh, somebody thinks it's O-O-O-L. Okay. Yes, this is a little bit hard to tell. The letters are positioned so closely together, it's difficult to tell whether the O and the L are actually the letter D. And as somebody pointed out, the C could actually be an O as well. To avoid this, use fonts which incorporate appropriate spacing between the letters. Font weight refers to the font's overall thickness, which can impact the ability to easily read the text. Some fonts are made of lighter or heavier weights, and this can be increased when we make text bold. On this slide, in an example from AIM, you can see this. So one more time, audience, which is easier to read? The top line, which is lighter, or the bottom line, which is darker? Yes, our audience is weighing in, and I agree. The second is easier to read. The first sentence says, this text is a very thin or lightweight that is in a light gray color, making it difficult to read. The second sentence says, this text uses the same typeface with a heavier weight. It's in a darker, more pronounced color. That paired with bolding, the letters make it easier to read. But keep in mind, this may not always be true. Sometimes bolding can affect the letter spacing and readability, which we mentioned in the previous slide. So let's wrap this up with some general practices for font and text. We discussed how bolding may or may not make a font or text more accessible. Related to this, When there is a change in style of font or text, it requires the user to adjust to read the information. Because of this, it's best to use bold, italicized, capitalized, and stylized fonts for specific applications, not for a large section of text. The alignment of the text in relationship to the page margins can also affect readability. It is best to use left justification for reading left to right, which means the words are aligned along the left margin of the page. Julie, now that we've learned about how font can influence readability and accessibility of a document, let's take another look at our newsletter.
That sounds great. So audience, you can take a look at this again and enter in the chat what you notice about the fonts in the newsletter. So we have bolding too much isn't the best for screen readers. Okay. It's hard to read and the fonts and colors can be unclear, alternating colors. Lots of great suggestions here. So it looks like they're coming in so fast I can hardly read them here, which is great. So the font styles aren't readable and consistent, and it's too mixed. Complexity of the fonts used. I see the angled images. It's not left justified in the bottom section. Various weights of the fonts. So wow, this is a great discussion on how the fonts can impact the accessibility of the document. Thanks for your input. Before we move on, we'll pause for questions. So let's feel free to put any questions you might have so far in the chat. So one of the first pre-submitted questions we had is, what are the best practices for images with easy read content and developing for audiences to process information differently?
I'd be happy to answer that. Many of the concepts that we're sharing today applies to all users. So to start, use plain language that is clear, concise, free of jargon, technical terms, or acronyms, and then present images with proper color contrast and with alt text that's written in plain language. Do we have any other questions?
I see there's a question about colors, which I think some information coming up here may help provide some clarification on that.
Yes, we're going to be touching
best,
on colors.
Yeah, best and worst colors to use. So another one is the accessibility is a huge issue for those who communicate in sign language. What issues have you heard or have been addressed with it?
So we have had employers ask us to consult on ways to communicate effectively between individuals who are hearing, hard of hearing, and or deaf, and for ideas on providing reasonable accommodations to perform the job. We have had Accessible Ohio partners ask about best practices for using sign language interpreting services at meetings and events specific to their venues. In these cases, we customize our resources based on our partners' unique environments and goals and rely on the guidance and best practices for providing sign language interpretation, reasonable accommodations, and ways for everyone to communicate with each other effectively.
Okay, it looks like, let's see. Why is it important to have accessible communications if I don't think anyone with a disability is using them?
Well, it is important to be proactive and create communications in an accessible way for two reasons. First, we don't always know if the individual we're creating the communication for has a disability or if the communication will be shared with someone who does. Many disabilities could affect one's ability to access communication that aren't apparent. For example, low vision, dyslexia, or hard of hearing. Second, making communications accessible can make these easier for everyone to access, making them truly an inclusive practice.
So yeah, great. All disabilities aren't visible. Thank you, Heather. That's so the other question, and this is a pretty common one that we might see, is what about using a fancy font for an email signature?
Okay. The same principles regarding font style, and color apply to our email signatures. So by sticking to a single simple font with proper color contrast, which we're going to get into later on, your contact information will be easy to read and accessible.
Okay. Thank you, audience, for the questions, and we'll pause again closer to the end and review any others that come in now. So now we're going to move on to our next topic, plain language. So the language you select when writing and the way you arrange the information makes a difference. Tanya, what is plain language?
Plain language is clear and concise. It is well organized and written for its intended audience. So here's some tips to consider for using plain language. You want to avoid jargon, acronyms, and highly technical terms. If these are needed, be sure to spell out the acronyms and define any technical terms that are used. Omit unnecessary words, use short, active sentences, and have a conversational tone. So here's an example of a complex sentence. The application must be completed by the applicant and received by the financial office by September 1st. And now let's state this information using a simple structure. We must receive your application by September 1st. Both sentences relay the same point. However, the second sentence is simpler to read. Some tips for organizing information in a simple format include being sure to use headings, numbered lists, and tables. Break information into short sections, and finally, ensure punctuation and capitalization are accurate. Whether we're sharing written information or images and graphics, we often rely on color in our communications. So Julie, let's talk about color and accessibility.
Of course. So we are going to address color contrast and using color to convey meaning. So simply put, the color contrast is the difference between the color of the text, images, and the background. And this is important to accessibility because improper color contrast can make images and words difficult to see. So using contrast appropriately makes written information more accessible. So you'll see on the slide, there's an example from the Universal Design Center. So the left column shows bad examples of color contrast, including blue on black, green on orange, red on green, and gray on purple. So the right column shows good examples of color contrast, including yellow on black, black on orange, black on green, and white on purple. So as demonstrated in the column on the right, there's a proper color. When there's a proper color contrast, the text is much easier to read. So we know that there are various shades of these colors, and while the examples that we selected show good contrast, not all shades of these colors have the proper contrast. It's always important to check. So we'll be sharing how to identify proper color contrast a bit later in the presentation.
Julie, relying on color alone to convey a message can make it inaccessible. We have an example on the slide. On the left side of the slide, you see a red circle with the word "select the red button" below it. A person with a color vision deficiency may not be able to distinguish colors. To make this accessible, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have a red circle with the word "red" in the middle. Below that are the words "select the red button." Using the combination of color and words to convey meaning is the best practice and makes this more accessible. Julie, let's take another look at our newsletter and see how we did with our use of color.
All right, let's do it. So audience, feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat and I'll give you a minute to type here. So you'll see on here things like click the green button or light blue boxes with print in them. So these colors can make it hard to read the text. I see bad color contrast in the blue buttons, not enough contrast. I'm unable to read anything in the blue buttons. So yeah, everyone's calling out kind of the same things here. So bad color combinations and inconsistent box shape. Okay.
Yeah,
So
click
our
the green
audience
button.
nailed it. So Tanya, what's the next topic we're going to discuss?
Well, next, I'd like to talk about alternative text. Adding alternative text, known as alt text, to images can make them accessible. For individuals with visual disabilities who use screen readers, alt text is read aloud by the screen reader to describe the image. Alt text is a written description that conveys the meaningful and essential information of an image. Alt text may describe aspects of images, including the settings, colors, and individuals. It describes concepts or information in images, and it can convey the action that will occur for functional images, such as activating a document to print. The description is intended to be succinct and concise. It may not always seem clear, though, when to use alt text. The Web Accessibility Initiative, which is part of the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, has a decision tree that may be helpful when determining when to use alt text. Ultimately, you use alt text when the image contributes meaning or information that is essential to the communication. For example, the image supplements other information or conveys an emotion, concept, or impression. There are several types of images to consider. Pictures such as photos, illustrations, or paintings, logos, graphs, charts and tables, and maps. Images that do not contain meaningful or essential information can be marked as decorative. Some examples include when the surrounding text describes the image and the image does not further contribute. When the image is used to enhance the visual appeal of the communication, and when the image is part of the design, like the graphics you see in the PowerPoint slide in today's webinars. Julie, let's discuss how to write alt text.
Sure. There are some best practices which are helpful. So alt text should be clear and concise and generally no longer than a sentence or two. And it's not necessary to include phrases like an image of or a photo of, because this information is provided by the screen reader the individual's using. However, it is helpful to indicate if the image is a painting, illustration, cartoon, graph, or map. So, and finally, make sure to end each sentence with a period. On the slide, we'll describe how to add alt text in a Word document or PowerPoint slide. So on the slide is an image of a mother holding her child and kissing her cheek. If you click on the right on the image, a box will populate on the right side. So you'll see the gray box pop up there with alt text. The box provides some tips for creating alt text and includes a box to enter and customize the alt text. And it's important to note that this box may include auto-generated alt text created using AI or artificial intelligence. You don't want to rely on this to be accurate. It's best to check if it's correct or if not, and write down your own description. So below the box is an option to mark the image as decorative. So Tanya, let's review an example from WAI.
Sure. On the slide are two images of a dog wearing a collar with a bell on it with surrounding text. Both images are the same. It's just the text that's different. For example, we see the picture of the dog with a bell on its collar. The text to the right of the picture reads, "Off-duty guide dog often wears a bell. Its ring helps the blind owner keep track of the dog's location." The written text only states that the off-duty guide dog often wears a bell. It doesn't give any information about what is present in the picture, an off-duty guide dog with a bell on its collar. Therefore, alt text is needed. For this image, the recommended alt text is dog with a bell attached to its collar. In example 2, the text reads, "Off-duty guide dog often wears a bell." Its ring helps the blind owner keep track of the dog's location. The bell is attached to the dog's collar. In the second example, because the written text describes how the bell is worn in the picture, the alt text isn't necessary. The alt text wouldn't give any information about the picture that wasn't already conveyed by the written text. Therefore, the picture in this example would be marked as decorative. So, here's another example where alt text can be considered. This is an example, an image from Pixabay that's using flattened copy over an image. It's a heartbeat line with the words "live, laugh, love" placed over the sunset. What would you suggest as alt text in this case? Audience, enter your ideas in the chat. Marked as decorative. Okay, heartbeat. Got any other ideas as you're thinking about it?
Sunset.
Yeah, we've got some good examples here. It's coming in fast. Heartbeat over sunset saying live, laugh, love. Decorative photo. Got a bunch of different ideas here. Sunset background, live, laugh, laugh. Live, love, love over a sunset. Live, love, laugh written over a red and orange sunset with a heartbeat line. So these are all good ideas. So when you're using flattened copy, the alt text needs to both describe the image and the words to ensure the entire meaning is conveyed. So when you're creating alt text, consider the best practices we shared. Remember, alt text is subjective and will vary from one creator to another. Now, Julie, let's move on to audio.
Great, thank you, audience, for all those suggestions. So, okay, there's three main ways audio communications can be made accessible. So the first is captioning, transcription, and sign language. So captioning captures the meaningful audio content from formats like a video or broadcast and puts these into words displayed on the screen. So captions should be easy to read. So think of the font size, and color contrast guidelines we've discussed earlier today, as well as accurate for spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Captions can be open or closed, and open captions are automatically on and cannot be turned off. Closed captions have the option to be turned on or off. Transcription is another way to make sure audio content is accessible. A transcript is a written version of an audio content like a podcast or this webinar. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is a tool that can also be used to automatically generate captions and transcriptions. This can be helpful, but keep in mind that AI can produce errors in spelling, grammar, and punctuation, which can compromise the accuracy. So when you do use AI, be sure to review and edit the captions and transcript before publishing them. So, and finally, consider using a trained professional to provide live captions for communications like meetings and events, and to create and review captions and transcripts for communications. So things like archive materials and social media posts. So Tanya, what about sign language?
Well, an additional way to make audio communications accessible is to provide sign language interpretation. This could be embedded in videos or added to audio communications. When recording the interpretation, use a plain background with proper contrast behind the interpreter so they can be easily seen. Julie, we're going to play an accessible Ohio video now. It's a good example of using captions and sign language in a video.
Ohio is the heart of it all, and through Accessible Ohio, it's also the heart of accessibility. I'm Julie Wood, Accessible Ohio Manager at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. By prioritizing accessibility and inclusiveness, we are creating environments where all Ohioans, including those with disabilities, are enabled to experience all our great state has to offer.
Tanya, that's a great example. So we have one more accessibility principle to share, accessible hyperlinks.
Yes, Julie, let's discuss some do's and don'ts to best describe how to include hyperlinks in an accessible way. The best practices you do want to include are, rather than using the actual URL or hyperlink, embed the link in text, underline the links and use a different color, be descriptive and concise, convey the purpose of the link, and spell out email addresses. Here are things you don't want to do. Don't use click here, learn more, or link to as a hyperlink. They do not provide information about the link. Avoid using all caps. A screen reader will read each individual letter. And avoid long URLs because screen readers read them one character at a time. So here's some examples to illustrate these tips. Instead of using the words click here for promotional details, use the phrase, our promotional details include more information, with promotional details being the hyperlink. Here you see a long URL. Instead, create a link such as Guide to Digital Accessibility.
Those are great tips, Tanya. So I'd like to talk about emojis, hashtags, and GIFs. These all have become regular parts of our communications. And emojis have their own unique description, and before selecting an emoji, review the description to ensure it relates to the context of the message. So emojis can be interpreted in more than one way, so use them in moderation. And the best place to insert an emoji is at the end of the sentence, so the user can process the content of the words and then interpret the emoji. So hashtags connect us to events, places, people, and more. They are used to help social media users find and engage with posts and they help categorize, organize, and track content. So just like emojis, hashtags can be interpreted in more than one way, so it's important to create these in an accessible format. So to make sure the right message is conveyed, capitalize the first letter of each word. So this is referred to as camel case because it provides a natural vertical flow of the letters, which appears like camel humps. So this makes it easier to read and improves the accessibility by allowing screen readers to read the hashtag correctly. It also makes it easier to read because the camel case replicates the visual cue normally associated with a space. For example, one of OOD's hashtags that you can see on the slide is hashtag accessible Ohio, which is written in camel case. And you'll notice the A in accessible and the O in Ohio are both capitalized, making it easier for your eyes and the screen reader to read. So Tanya, can you tell us about ensuring GIFs are also accessible?
I sure can. GIFs are images and or frames which can be combined to create still or dynamic animations. They're typically used to illustrate a point. When GIFs aren't accessible, they may not be effective in illustrating or emphasizing the point. So how do we make GIFs accessible? Well, first, provide a way to start, stop, or pause the GIF. Ensure the GIF automatically stops playing after 5 seconds. Ensure the GIF meets the WCAG requirements for rapidly flashing images. Keep in mind that flashing images may trigger headaches or seizures in some conditions. Include alt text to describe the GIF. And lastly, use proper color contrast with the background. Julie, let's take some time to consider the accessibility principles we just discussed by taking a look at our newsletter again.
Okay, sounds great. So audience, what do you notice? So we can see the emojis at the bottom. And the hashtag in the first box is written in camel case. We've got excessive use of emojis and lots of different fonts. And emojis don't go with the content of the words. So, okay.
And somebody noticed that the text is centered rather than left aligned.
Yeah, yeah. So I need camel
case in the email
case,
address.
yeah. So thanks again for your input. We appreciate the comments and the suggestions. So now we're going to take another moment for Q&A here. So we'll check here and see if we've got any questions that have come in. And we also have a few pre-submitted questions that came in during registration. So from what we were just talking about, it says, is there a reason why we're avoiding click here? I would think it's useful if the color ID for hyperlinks is an issue. I think it's more to do, yeah, it's what to do with how the screen reader reads it.
That, and also it doesn't provide any information about where that hyperlink is going to, other than it's clicking you to something.
Let's see if there's any other questions here. Okay. So there's questions about using QR codes for hyperlinks.
So QR codes can be used for hyperlinks. There is some different resources. I would love to talk with whoever submitted that question offline to see how they want to utilize those and probably provide some further in-depth information about that than we've got time for today.
Okay. So our next question is a pre-submitted question, and it says, I'd be interested in knowing more about accessible communication for blind, visually impaired, and deafblind.
That's a great question. We have included tips today that can be beneficial for everyone, including individuals with visual and hearing disabilities. And these include using alternative text to convey meaningful aspects of images, proper color contrast, how to embed web links in useful language, using captions, and the importance of testing to ensure assistive technology can be utilized with your communications. Our AR specialists are available to consult with venues and attractions about their accessibility goals and customize resources to help them create more inclusive environments.
That's great. And then Janet, we just added the link in there too, if you would like to reach out or view the website there for Accessible Ohio. So let's talk a moment about screen readers. And can you explain, Tanya, what it does?
Sure. A screen reader is a software program that enables people with visual disabilities like blindness or low vision to access and interact with a computer screen by reading the text aloud. It enables them to navigate and use applications effectively. It can also be useful to individuals who process information auditorily.
Great. We have another question from Deborah Cholton. Could you share again why it's best to have left justified?
Sure. When we have everything justified to the left, it just makes two things. It makes the screen reader work better. Full justification puts spaces between the letters and the words, While it looks really nice with each side being even, it makes it more difficult to read. So really it just comes down to it being more accessible for assistive technology and for individuals to read.
So another question, and this is, should captioning go on the top, the bottom, or the middle of the screen?
So most of the time, captioning is located at the bottom of the screen. However, if you're in a meeting and you're looking at a PowerPoint presentation and the line of sight to the bottom of the screen is blocked in some way, the top of the screen may be a better option. It is customary to have captioning at the bottom, so when it's provided at the top of the screen, it's best practice to inform users of its location. And then placing it in the middle of the screen may interfere with the visual content.
And another question, what about people who are colorblind? Do these tips help them?
Yes, these tips can enhance accessibility for all individuals, including those with color blindness. It's an important tip to remember to not rely on color alone to convey meaning. Instead, combine color with a word and or a symbol to ensure the meaning is conveyed in more than one way.
Okay. Thanks, Tanya, for being our expert resource here today. I don't see any other questions that have come in at the moment. So we're going to move on to our tools and resources. Oh, we got one more. Do these tips work well with screen readers with Braille output?
That is a good question. I do know that these tips work well with screen readers. I would suspect they work well with Braille output, but I can get back to you with more resources about that.
So, and then another comment, also when doing captioning right on the screen, making sure that the background screen is black with white font. That's very important. So thank you, Victoria, for that. So, all right, so now let's talk about some tools and resources that are available to help ensure your communications are accessible. So we have the accessibility checker that's built into Microsoft 365 suite of applications. There's a no-cost contrast checker from WebAIM. Some social media checks are also available and helpful hints for accessible documents to keep in mind. The importance of testing and asking for feedback. And don't forget that OOD is here to help. So our website offers guidance on practical tips to ensure your communications are accessible to individuals with disabilities. And we put that link in the chat.
Julie, I'll start with Microsoft. They offer a built-in accessibility checker in applications like Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook. This is a no-cost tool that can be used to identify accessibility barriers in your documents. When a barrier is found, instructional information and suggestions for fixing the problems are provided. For example, the accessibility checker will indicate when an image does not include alt text and when color contrast is hard to read. It is best practice to turn this feature on when you're beginning work on a document and keep it on so you can make it accessible as you work. I'll describe on the slide how to find the accessibility checker. It can be found in Outlook under File, Options, Accessibility. And then if you're working in PowerPoint and Word, you can find it under Review, Check Accessibility. The accessibility checker finds most accessibility barriers, but there are some it can't detect. So be sure to manually review the document for additional barriers. Those additional barriers can be the language used, font style, or layout.
That's a very helpful tool, Tanya. So I know that we've had a couple questions throughout in the chat about this next topic, and it's a tool that I'll talk about called the contrast checker from WebAIM. And this is an example of which is on the slide here. So this is a no-cost tool that can be used to test the accessibility of foreground and background colors. So in our example, you can see where the color information for both the foreground and the background colors are listed. And you can change the color choice for the foreground, background, or both. You can also change the lightness for each. The contrast checker will produce a contrast ratio between the foreground and the background colors, and the contrast checker provides a result of pass or fail for normal text and large text according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So in our example on the lower left, you can see that our contrast has passed. So one especially helpful aspect of this tool is the ability to try different color combinations before applying them to a communication like a PowerPoint slide.
Julie, as you know, many organizations utilize social media for marketing, outreach, and hiring. You might not know that social media platforms often contain ways to implement accessibility components. According to Alexa Henrik, a social media manager at a Florida university, content creators should only use the default fonts and formatting options readily available on the social media platforms. This is because custom fonts and alternative characters are not always accessible. Accessibility features do vary between social media platforms. So Instagram provides directions for using a screen reader, adjusting text size, adding and editing alt text, using captions, and options to edit auto-generated captions. They have a resource for crafting an accessible Instagram feed. Facebook provides directions for using keyboard shortcuts to navigate, using screen readers, using closed captions, adjusting text size and color contrast, and reporting a problem experienced. And then X lists the accessibility features often included screen readers and refreshable braille display supports, auto captioning, keyboard shortcuts, voice control, and contact information if additional support is needed. The X Help Center includes directions for using the features. LinkedIn Help Center provides directions for accessibility features such as screen reader support. They include contact information if support is needed to use their products with assistive technology. LinkedIn provides support through Be My Eyes, which is a no-cost visual assistance service that works through a live video call.
Tanya, when we incorporate accessibility into content on a computer browser for social media, it may present differently on a mobile device. So it's important to check both formats and adjust if needed. So I know you have some helpful hints for creating accessible documents I'd like to share.
I do, Julie. So when we're creating a document, such as a newsletter in Word, use a simple and logical structure. If you're using columns to present and organize information, use the built-in columns feature rather than creating the appearance of columns using tabs or manual spacing. The columns feature will enable screen readers and other assistive technologies to read the text in the proper sequence. And think about the layout. Align text to the left with a ragged right edge. Also avoid full justification. While full justification may look appealing because of its uniform flushed edges, the style makes the spacing between the letters and the words in every row of text different, which can make it more difficult to read. Once your document is complete, you can proofread language under the Review tab in Word. You may find that you need to export a Word document to Adobe to create a PDF version for your document. Adobe also has an accessibility checker tool that can help flag common accessibility issues. So now, Julie, what are some final thoughts and ways to test and the importance of asking for feedback?
AI is helpful, but it doesn't catch every error. So remember to manually test your communications. So you can do this by using a screen reader, applying the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and reviewing language used for alt text and embedded links. And also consider user testing. Include people with disabilities that ask for feedback, and consider the experiences of people who are blind and have low vision, might be using screen readers or magnifiers to engage with the content, are deaf or hard of hearing and might need to access audio content and visual text formats, have physical disabilities and may need to navigate using a keyboard or other adaptive interface rather than a mouse, or have cognitive disabilities that might benefit from clear, consistent, easy to navigate sites with tolerance for user error. And we're here to help at OOD. Our accessibility coordinator can check parts of your website, such as the job postings page for screen reader accessibility. And if you're interested in learning more, please contact your business relations specialist. Most importantly, use a reasonable accommodation or modification statement in key areas of your communications and communications platforms. So this lets individuals know who to contact if they experience a barrier to accessing your communications. So include one or more ways to contact, such as a phone number and email, or assign responsibility for receiving these inquiries and following through with finding a solution to remove the barrier and providing access. Having this statement sends a message to your customers and employees that you care about accessibility and inclusion. So finally, listen to feedback from your customers, employees, and guests. Feedback is important and demonstrates your commitment to inclusive and accessible communication. It also provides you with information needed to develop strategies to address barriers for current and future communications. And before we finish our time together, Tanya, let's take one final look at our newsletter.
Sure. On the left-hand side, we have the newsletter we started with. And on the right, we have a newsletter that we created utilizing all the accessibility tips, tricks, and tools we discussed today. Audience, what do you notice? Is there any improvements here? Much improved, easier to read. Fewer fonts, right.
So much better, lots.
So yes, the font is now consistent in each section. It's simple. The color contrast is good. The alt text or the text boxes are the same shape. The text at the bottom is now left justified. It's more balanced. We got rid of the emojis. The hashtags are in right? We got the camel case hashtag for the hashtags and the email. Yeah, it's a lot better.
So as we're running on close on time here, so I'd like to note that what would you expect if this was a digital newsletter? So alt text, probably hyperlinks, captions. Tanya, do you have anything else you'd like to include here?
Julie, incorporating the guidelines and the principles from the ADA, WCAG, and Universal Design into your communications, whether in the digital or physical environment, helps ensure these are accessible to everyone, including individuals with disabilities and individuals who may use assistive devices to access information like screen readers. Just as we would make a door accessible with an automatic door opener and a clear path to maneuver through a doorway, communication pieces include accessibility elements as well. So that brings us to the close of today's webinar. It's been a pleasure sharing information about how to create accessible communications. We hope that you'll be able to utilize the tools and resources available to further ensure accessibility in your communications. As a reminder, this is not an exhaustive list of ideas, best practices, and tips. We do hope this information has been helpful. If you would like additional information, please reach